Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, and in today's video we're going to talk about the bare fundamentals of spiritual work. And the reason I'm making this video is I was triggered by a recent search online for retreats and cool destinations, and it made me realize that there has been now an explosion of what you could call spiritual tourism, and together with that the commercialization and also a kind of a Chinese menu of modalities and spiritual things that you can do. And I think that many of them have grown from, let's say, the interest of staying commercially relevant, maybe as a resort or a studio in, I don't know, Bali or the Maldives or wherever it may be, to attract people and make things interesting. So you see cocoa ceremonies and sound bath this, and the circle of writing intentions and burning them to the higher gods or whatever. So there's thousands of things to do and practices out there, and there's all these different modalities that have come about. And I thought, how does one navigate this whole big list of options and this menu of things to do, and what's good for you and what do you need, what creates real lasting change versus what doesn't. So what I thought I'd do is I thought I would walk through what I believe to be the absolute essence of spiritual work, and to explain it in very simple terms, so that whenever you choose to do a certain practice, you should have this essence in the back of your head and ask yourself, is this helping or not? So we start with what I believe to be the three big steps in what we're trying to do ultimately. And that would be stabilize, clarify, and integrate. And we see ourselves as a system. So we see ourselves as a system that begins in a state of lack of stability and also lack of clarity and integration. These three, by the way, build on one another, but typically you can see this as a kind of ladder that kind of builds as time goes by. So when we start, our mind could be seen as a system that is kind of unstable, that is signified by these sort of little wavy lines that are going around, and it is also unclear, and that is signified by these question marks that we have here, right? And things are kind of all over the place, so there's no integration going on. So everything is a kind of state of not very stable or clear flux, and there are all these discrepant parts moving around. Now, what you could call this is a state of high entropy, right? Entropy, which is another way to say that things are a mess. And because things are a mess from a systems perspective, then the output or the music that comes out of this system is actually quite not that great. So our very first task is to spend time stabilizing our mind. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that in practice is we need to get to the point where our nervous system can regulate itself, knows how to be stable, stay stable, and if ever taken off of its center through events in our lives or past memories and things like that, the system knows how to regain its stability, right? So the training and the consistent cultivation of our nervous system, of knowing how to enter parasympathetic states of mind, and to essentially train the system over time to self-regulate, and therefore to also gain more confidence in itself. There's no avoiding that stage, right? And that is a stage where we need to spend a lot of our time, actually. So many years of practice are required to contravene or to overturn tendencies of mind that have been inherited and that have also grown during our lives, in which we become essentially stressed and unbalanced. And so it's bitter work, right? It takes a long time to do that, and there is no quick retreat or cocoa ceremony or ayahuasca ceremony that is going to solve that for us. It may give us a bit of a nice extra push, but what this essentially means is that we need to spend time sitting in meditation, and also spend time either sitting or standing doing breath work and embodiment practices that are cultivation practices which aim to fundamentally change the way that our system operates over time. If we would make the comparison, or if we were comparing what a musician does, this would be the equivalent to learning our scales, right? It's bitter work. It's just bitter, consistent work over time, doing the work. If we do an ayahuasca retreat or a cocoa ceremony, or the burning of intentions or the singing of kumbaya, that's going to give us a nice little peek. It might give us a taste of what we're trying to get. But if again we compare it to the musician training analogy, we need to make a distinction between getting together in a living room for a little jam session with a buddy or two versus practicing the scales, right? There's something to be said about practicing the scales over time, and so stabilizing our mind. Now, you see that once we do that work, our system is going to change. So these little wavy lines here, let's draw it all over again because it's easier. So the wavy lines have become more stable. Maybe they wave around a little bit more, but in general, you see that the system has become stable. And that means that what used to be question marks now become, things that we can kind of observe. Maybe there's still some question marks out there, but in general, we start to notice that there are certain things here or there that we can now observe more clearly in the mind, right? So they become known elements. So stability gives us that chance. Gives us the chance to see through the activities of the mind as opposed to being caught in the activities of the mind. Therefore, we gain meta perspective. Now, when we gain enough stability, then these elements that were unknown start to become known. And the very next task is to begin to clarify those elements. So we begin to gain clarity and to take elements in our mind and we begin to make them known, right? So they were completely unknown. So they were unknown unknowns, and now they are known unknowns, if that makes any sense. So then we start to clarify them, and we spend time using this stability to gain clarity of observation, and we begin to sort of fill in the blanks. We mainly do this with elements which create instability. Therefore, these unknowns, because they were unknown, are the ones that create the waviness around. But as we start to observe them, right, so we use our stability, so we make effort to preserve stability at first, and then we notice that these elements are the ones that create the instability because of their unknowingness. So we begin to clarify them, right? We clarify more and more, we begin to know them more. One of the things that we begin to notice as we create that bigger amount of knowingness, we notice that these elements seem to be very often at odds with each other. Yeah? So not only were they unknown, but they were also disconnected and often in disagreement. My heart says one thing, but my mind says another. I want this now, but a different thing later. I am confused about how to approach a certain situation, or I can't make up my mind whether I like or dislike this person because he does these good things, but those bad things, right? So you have different parts of you are in constant argument or negotiation and contention, and this is because we notice that they are acting as separate elements. They are not connected with one another, right? And that's part of the knowingness that we gain, is the knowingness of understanding each of these elements and seeing how separate they are. And so we begin to know more and more and more and more, right, through the steps of clarification. So stabilization would typically be when you start to do embodiment practice when you start to stabilize your breath, when you practice focused meditation. Clarification starts to become more in the realm of what's called vipassana meditation. So we start to dispassionately become more aware and observe elements in our mind in a sustained way to clarify them, right? So we begin to clarify our mind, and as we begin to clarify our mind, the need to stabilize, the need for effort to stabilize the mind becomes lower. Yeah, so the effort that we had to put in at first was because of the lack of clarity, but things start to become more clear and therefore more stable. But we notice that, even though we know these elements well, still they move us around, and we lose our stability very often still, despite the fact that we know our shortcomings or things in our mind. And that's when the effort of integration comes in. And integration is an interesting one, because integration is, rather than being a step, is an outcome of stability and clarity, right? So as we begin to clarify more and more, we begin to notice that between this dot and this dot, there was another unknown, another question mark, but we sort of found out it was there, we clarified it, and there was another one here, and there was another one here, right? So now what used to be disparate functions in our mind and emotions and the feeling of our body or whatever become a single thing, and then this becomes, you could call it a kind of stable block of knowingness. And that stable block of knowingness is very difficult to wiggle, is very difficult to destabilize anymore. And eventually, over time, that feeds our stability, and that stability feeds more clarity. So we keep mapping, we keep finding out, hey, there's another element here, and another one here, and this becomes another little block of stability here in the mind. And then we suddenly find that these two blocks were joined by a certain element here, another insight, right? So that's where insights start to grow in the mind, and on we go, up until the point where we get to a mind that is completely stable and completely clear, and therefore it's completely integrated. But here the therefore feeds one another. So because it's integrated, it's clear. Because it's integrated, it's stable. Because it's clear, it can stabilize more and integrate more, and so on, right? So these start to become completely building on one another. They reinforce each other. Stability, clarity, integration of the mind. And the mind then becomes a unity. It become, you could call it a singularity almost, or something like that, right? It's a system that is completely integrated within itself, and therefore it cannot destabilize itself anymore. Because, as it turns out, things that were destabilizing us were internal disconnections as opposed to external events. Now, having said all that, so these are the fundamentals of what we're trying to do with the mind. And what is important here is to understand that it requires a lot of effort and work in the beginning, because our mind tends to be unstable by default. And it is also unclear by default. Now, some people are more clear and stable by default, right, than others. Some people are incredibly unstable or incredibly sensitive, right, and that destabilizes the mind. It is important to understand that just because you may be a fairly stable and happy-go-lucky, easygoing person, that doesn't mean that you are enlightened or that you have finished the work that needs to be done, right? So the fact that you have sort of, lactose-free blood running through your veins instead of hot blood doesn't mean that you are a fully enlightened individual. It simply means that you have an easier starting point, which is more stable, and therefore your work should be primarily to clarify and investigate more, so that the integration goes up and the entropy goes down. Now, it's ironic, because if you have a very stable mind, the likelihood that you are willing to put in the effort to stabilize even further and clarify and integrate further are lower. your problem is kind of solved. You're taking it easy. You feel like you're doing fine. You have no big questions in your mind, or big existential problems or whatever, or a lot of stress, or you know how to deal with it in a very easygoing way. So your the effort you're willing to put in is likely to be less, as a matter of fact. Is very often the case, or it is said that dukkha, or suffering, is the mud out of which the lotus of the Buddha grows, right? So that's the fuel or the engine to do the work, is lack of stability, because lack of stability, lack of clarity, lack of integration feel like pain to an individual. They feel like mental and emotional suffering, right? That's what all the friction feels like when you have too many unknowns and disconnections within your own mind. So so this is a kind of going back to the basics. This is almost like a basic map of what we're trying to do with our mind. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that the bitter work cannot and should not be avoided, and that it definitely is not to be substituted by one-off retreats, or a yearly this, or taking certain substances, or singing together with a group, or things like that. To integrate, clarify, and stabilize the mind is a long-term, arduous, sometimes difficult, often painful, nuanced, and a delicate process that just takes effort and time, and a lot of desire to actually transform, right? So anyone selling you methodologies that do things magically, or that 10-minute somatics I was reading the other day, and I'm like, solve trauma with 10 minutes of this or that. It seems that our nervous system is simply not wired to transform that quickly or easily, and that we need to do the work, right? And of course, if there's some shortcuts here or there to help accelerate the process, I'm definitely all for it. And I'm personally researching a few of those so that I can, share them and use them myself. But so far, it seems to be that we just need to do a lifetime of work to overturn millions of years of evolution in which our nervous system was rewarded, or had a higher chance of being passed on to the next generation if it veered to the side of stress. So we need to retrain that in order to stabilize and live a more harmonious lives. So I hope that helps. I hope it helps you put into context some of the practices that you may be doing, and I'll be back with more. Cheerio.